Welcome to the Clinical Athlete Journal Club number 18. My name is Quinn Hennick, and I am a proud clinical athlete provider, and I'm joined by Kevin McNamara, a physical therapist, currently completing a residency at Johns Hopkins. He's a longtime Clinical Athlete Forum member and the one responsible for bringing the Journal Club to life. So thanks for being here as always, Kevin.
Absolutely, Quinn. These are getting better and better as we're going along. Working out the kinks with everything. So
yeah, I agree. So if you guys are curious about the impetus for this and kind of what's become our motto, way back in the day, a smart guy named Benjamin Franklin started a weekly club that was called the Junto Club. It was a mutual improvement club, but it was basically just a room of really smart people discussing topics and issues of the day, kind of like this. And they had an important policy. And that policy was that all discussions would be conducted in the sincere spirit of inquiry after truth, without fondness of dispute or desire of victory. And that's kind of become our Journal Club motto. So we're all on the same team. We're all trying to be less wrong. That doesn't mean that we can't have discussions, and that doesn't mean that we can't have disagreements. It's just that you're not coming into that looking to win. You're coming into it looking to learn. And hopefully that's an approach we can take moving forward. So the topic for tonight's Journal Club is a dynamic systems approach to sports med. And I've made a few poll questions to get a feel for the room, and I'm going to launch that. So you should get some poll questions in front of you. So first one is, who are you? Clinician, student clinician, coach, trainer, student coach, or trainer. So if you could click those. Question 2 is, have you read or learned about dynamical systems theory in the past? And then number 3 is, for those that read the papers, was it difficult to apply clinical relevance? As you were reading them, in your mind, were you thinking, I don't know how this applies to me on a practical level, or the opposite? So we've got about, looks like almost two-thirds of us are clinicians. The other almost third are student clinicians, and then coach and trainer make up the rest. So mostly clinicians tonight, it looks like. And number 2, have you read about dynamical systems in the past? 58% says yes. That's a good chunk. 42% say no. So these are 2 good papers to kind of get the ball rolling. And then the references in these papers too will kind of get you going. And also, if you guys were here for journal clubs, maybe two or 3 ago, where we talked about a constraints-led approach to coaching the power clean, a lot of this will resonate and kind of almost be a summary, as we talked about putting dynamical systems in practice. So we're almost doing it in the reverse order, talking about the practicality of it in that meeting, and now talking more of theoretical in this meeting. And then number 3, for those that read the papers, was it difficult to apply clinically? And 59% said yes. Join the club. Okay, so let's just dig in. Honestly, don't know where to start with stuff like this, because so we've got 2, and I'll kind of go over the first one here. Raphael Pohl is the lead author, and this is a paper from 2018, and the title is From Microscopic to Macroscopic Sports Injuries, Applying the Complex Dynamic Systems Approach to Sports Medicine, a narrative review. So a narrative review, just talking about kind of what type of evidence we're talking about here. So we've got a group of authors, this is kind of their expert opinion. So it's a review article, so they try to aggregate papers and current literature on a particular topic, but it's not a systematic review, meaning they don't go through a repeatable and rigorous process for identifying these papers. There's no hard inclusion, exclusion criteria. It's just kind of these are the papers that we feel resonate with the topic, and we'll kind of give our 2 cents. And it's not a meta-analysis, so it's not a study. There's no data in this type of paper. It's kind of that expert opinion piece. But these are good for just kind of driving questions forward and proposing future research on a particular topic. In this case, implementing dynamic systems into a sports medicine realm. And so dynamical systems is kind of this mathematical model that's been implemented in economics and meteorology and mathematics to try to model complex systems. And what do we mean by complex systems? It means a system that's got a lot of moving parts and factors that interact with other factors. And these interactions are not necessarily linear. So A plus B doesn't necessarily equal C. A plus B may equal Z, but only in certain scenarios. And then A plus B equals F in other scenarios. And F, once F is created, comes back and alters A and B. So you have this constantly flowing dynamic interaction between constraints, between factors here. And that's what these two papers are trying to model and to make sense of in regards to, in this case, injury prediction and prevention, trying to model that. So the first paper, I'm just going to kind of do a brief review, throw it to Kevin, and then maybe throw it to the chat and see what's what here. But the first paper kind of going over a dynamical systems approach. And if you look at figure 2, and I'll just start sharing my screen. Okay, do you see my screen? Yeah. So looking at figure 2, you know, right off the bat, this is kind of the idea that we're trying to get across, is that you can look at this from the top down, you can look at it from the bottom up, but neither level it necessarily supersedes itself. There's a constant interaction between levels up and down. Level above regulates the activity of level below, changes the way that level above regulates. And you can see this from the cellular level all the way up to the individual and the task and how they interact with the environment. And so that's kind of the general principle here. And I think if we don't take away anything else from a practicality standpoint, the dynamic system model can at least help you understand that there is a ton of complexity. There are many factors at play, and it almost forces you to embrace the inherent uncertainty that are kind of within these complex systems. And so if you can embrace that, that's a great start. And just kind of in your mind, understand that you're not going to have all the answers. So that's kind of what we're looking at here in that figure is trying to conceptualize what we're talking about. And then the idea in this paper is that these injuries that occur, and not necessarily the injuries that have a direct, distinct mechanism, like Adrian Peterson taking a helmet to his knee and tearing his ACL, you know, in those cases, we can say in the moment, there's a causality. There's a linear relationship between the amount of force that went into Adrian Peterson's knee and the amount of load that the ACL could not tolerate. However, that linear piece is still just a piece of a much more dynamic system, because in that moment, what was the play and why did Adrian Peterson make that move to put him in? So there's a lot of those factors, but in that moment, those acute injuries, we can snapshot and say, okay, there's that linear relationship. But they give examples of things like tendinopathy that don't necessarily have a linear relationship. There's not any one inciting event. And beyond that, we know that somebody with tendinopathic changes upon ultrasound or MRI are more likely to experience symptoms, but not necessarily guaranteed to experience symptoms. And it's hard for us to make those changes to the tissues anyway, but there is somewhat of a relationship there. And we've also seen in Achilles ruptures, the majority of those who have spontaneous ruptures of the Achilles have tendinopathic changes in their tendon. Now, in this paper, what they're trying to model, and you can agree with it or not, and I'll scroll down here to figure 4, this is kind of the model of the entire paper. So they have these let's say micro injuries. And now why do those occur? Well, perhaps there's an interplay between training load, their readiness states. Are they not getting new job, stress levels are high. So the same training load that they were doing before is now overloading the tissues. Regardless, dynamic interaction is superseding tolerance at the cellular level, and you start to see these micro injuries, things that are not necessarily perceptible. And then according to the model, these micro injuries potentially increase over time if load and other factors continue to interact in that, we'll call it more pathological than adaptive state. These micro injuries start to connect. And then we reach this critical threshold where that micro injury now, it's kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back, where there's enough micro and meso injury, let's say at the cellular and motor unit level or sarcomere level, where now we have a catastrophic failure of the system as a whole. And that may look like a spontaneous Achilles rupture. So, take Kobe Bryant when he tears Achilles in like 2013, where he just took a step that he's done a million times and then, boom, gone. Kevin Durant, same thing. So this model here is trying to explain those things, that perhaps there were some micro level injuries. You hit some critical threshold, and then on the a micro incident can now have a macro effect. And they describe it, I've got it highlighted, as a nonlinear avalanche. And how's that for fucking grim? but that's the idea. And when we think about training also, we can think about training as linear. We make periodic linear gains over time, but as you train more and more, the reality is a lot of times you don't make PRs for a while, and then all of a sudden the stars align and you just start crushing it. That's that nonlinear effect. And this paper is essentially saying that the opposite can be true too in regards to injury, or the same can be true, but mirroring that, instead of adaptive performance, we can look at it as pathological or injury. The problem is this is all hypothetical, and this is a model that would need to be studied. This is a model that, looking at this micro injury as kind of the precipitator of the model, this is very difficult to do. It's very difficult to look at those. We don't have great tools for that. If you dig into some of the tendinopathy literature, we're starting to look at those things. Like, what does the whole of the donut, that tendinopathic area, actually look like on the fiber level? But we're not there yet to reliably measure that stuff over time, because we would have to be tracking these things over time, right? This is a process that occurs over timescales, weeks, months, potentially years. So I'm going to stop there, because I think that kind of summarizes the paper. And then the rest of the paper is just kind of, where do we go from here? Challenges for the future. So mapping out potentially some of the things to look at to test the model. But Kevin, what do you think about this particular paper?
Yeah, where to kind of even begin? I think, thinking back to when we talked about like movement screens and predicting injury, and we reference, Roald Barr's paper on why movement screens to predict injury will probably never work. Definitely, if you kind of take his approach using more of a statistical look at it, and then you kind of go through this paper and see all of the kind of basic science elements, or just the system of systems that make these things so difficult, you can definitely see why he kind of has that approach. I think this is a difficult topic to kind of talk about, simply because it requires a lot of dot connecting to kind of come up with any sort of conclusion. I like the paper, and I like this sort of thought process in terms of organizing all the complexity and creating some sort of framework to think about. This is challenging, because on one end of the spectrum, and I think this is a fine balance, where we don't want to be reductionist in these things, but at the same time, the opposite of reductionism is globalism. So I don't know how to really reconcile if everything matters, then nothing matters. And I think that's what's challenging about this sort of concept is there's so many factors and there's so much going on, moving from cellular level to cellular components, et cetera, et cetera. It's hard to organize your thoughts and really come to any sort of solid conclusion. And I think, what I did like about this paper, I like this idea of connectivity and kind of shifting the idea of risk factors, which are generally considered to be more stable constructs, into more constraints, which is something that is fluid, kind of ever evolving. And I think that's much more replicative of something that we see in like a sports performance world or even a rehabilitation world, where the risk factors, some of them obviously are not going to be actionable, but they're always going to be kind of changing and shifting throughout rehab. And I think, what's a risk factor one day may not be considered a risk factor the next day. And I think that's an interesting thing to kind of think about. And as much as it maybe adds to the uncertainty, I also think that in some ways it helps maybe shed some light onto why certain things may have varying levels of importance one day to the next. And this idea of kind of musculoskeletal system stability, it reminds me, I think Val Nasedkin talked about this, kind of balancing the curve of readiness and the curve of preparedness, and trying to find a balance between that, and utilizing some of those heuristics to guide decision making in terms of programming, because you have to understand kind of where this person is at. Are they at a maximum level of preparedness? Great. That means that we can probably push the envelope a little bit in terms of training and driving adaptations. What's their readiness level like? And I think that's something that's we're always trying to balance. I don't know. I feel like I'm rambling a little bit here, but that's kind of what this article reminded me of. And it's trying to find that sweet spot between readiness and preparedness, or stability and instability.
So I think that actually dovetails really nicely into Cody's comment and question here. And he says, regarding the section titled interoceptive awareness measurements, and they basically say sometimes just as something as simple as asking the athlete, quote unquote, how do you feel, to get an idea of readiness potentially. And then Cody says, due to the complex, dynamic, and emergent nature of sensory experience, can we reliably identify perceptions that specifically correlate with microinjury? So that's question one. And I mean, my answer right now is hell no. But can we in the future? Yeah, I don't, it's a big shoulder shrug, but to say, what if the athlete says, well, they walk into the gym and they say, well, I feel like shit. Does that mean they have extensive micro injury? And also Cody then goes on to say, and this is really the question that I always ask as well, is how would we run the risk, and would we run the risk of instilling hypervigilance to pain and soreness? And I liken this a lot to readiness measures, as in things like testing grip strength or vertical jump, or even just subjective wellness. How do you rate your readiness to train before the training session? In my mind, I'm always like, gosh, is that a self-fulfilling prophecy? Now they're going to walk in and really kind of take an inventory. Oh yeah, I feel like shit today. It's going to be a bad day. One of those things where we know if we walk into the gym feeling like shit, sometimes you get moved and you warm up and you actually have a great session, and vice versa. You could feel great walking in and you end up not having a great session. And what's the correlation between that subjective perception and this model of kind of an accumulation of tissue damage? It's hard to say, because in this paper, on table table 1, they give kind of time scales, constraints / risk factors, and then time scales. And you look at, we're talking from fractions of a second with the stretch shortening cycle, and ACL tears happening in 400ths of a second when the foot touches the ground, to weeks, months, and years in regards to progression of training, and potentially the progression of these micro traumas cascading and avalanching into a macro trauma. So the model of it has plausibility, or just kind of the idea seems plausible that there's this critical threshold that something you did 1,000 times has now become a problem. And it's now a problem because of a dynamic interplay of many factors. But to accurately model that, gosh, that seems like a tall task. And I'm actually going to go and screen share the second paper, because at the end of the day, it doesn't give us any more answers, but so it's this Betancourt complex systems approach for sports injuries, moving from risk factor identification to injury pattern recognition. I think the narrative just kind of helped to make sense of the poll paper potentially, is that we don't necessarily look at risk factors in isolation, but the idea in the future will be trying to risk profile. So can we see patterns of how certain risk factors tend to interact? And then that's that. Yeah.
I think, what's the guy's name? He was on the podcast. Nickel Van Dyke talked about this a lot, and sort of kind of shifting the narrative more towards we're just managing risk more than anything. But it's a moving target, right? I think the most challenging thing is trying to figure out, and it's maybe not an answerable question of, what is it that got us to a point where the system's no longer able to regain a sense of stability.
And that's kind of, yeah. I think that's in the second paper here with this figure 2, is they kind of model what we've been talking about. Is that now you have all of these factors, some modifiable, some non-modifiable. They interact with themselves and they magnify themselves. Sometimes they cancel themselves out. Over time, we're able to highlight the ones that tend to skew the outcomes, and we highlight the ones that interact in such a way that tend to skew the outcomes and have more of an effect. Or perhaps we can create that probability model based on kind of a subset of these factors. But with this paper, what they're saying is it's not the risk factors that you really look at. It's the interaction, and then this middle ground here, these patterns, or these quote unquote regularities or irregularities that we actually use to make our decisions. So it's not any easier of a model, but I think from a implementation or a how does this look? How would this look if we tried to do it? This provided me a better mental representation. And that's the second paper. We got a question here from David. Do you think if a practitioner would have had Kobe and Kevin Durant do eccentric lands more often with the goal of decreasing chances of tendon ruptures, would they have had different outcomes? Maybe they already were. We don't know what their training program was like. Kobe, they both actually were in the playoffs when they tore. So, they're deep into the season. We don't know what their training pattern was like in that time. And so it's just impossible to say. And then David goes on to ask, is it conscious training, subconscious, or does shit just happen sometimes? The shit just happens sometimes is always a piece of this. Whether the shit wouldn't have happened, or the likelihood is probably more accurate to say that it wouldn't, we could reduce the likelihood of an event happening potentially. But one thing that Nickel Van Dyke talked about in the podcast was, if you prevented an injury, you wouldn't actually have known that you prevented it. And injury prevention. So Eric Mara kind of cleared this up on the podcast that we had just dropped with him. I actually think it was in part 2 of it, which will be coming soon. But he says, injury prevention is a thing on the macro scale. So you can look at prospectively the rate of injury in a population. And if you do something, and then prospectively that rate of injury changes, you have prevented injury from a rate standpoint. It's on the individual level is the problem. And even if we could get to the point where we could say this athlete has a 73% chance, it's a 70% chance of rain today. This athlete has a 70% chance of injury. And we were accurate the way that we can accurately predict weather on a shorter time scale. What do you do then? Do you not play that athlete? There's a lot of other questions here that go beyond even the difficulty of modeling these things accurately. Shannon asks, as clinicians, do you think knowledge of dynamical systems complexity theory has enhanced your decision-making? If so, how? Well, I think if anything, it's allowed me to take a step back and I think have better conversations. My informed consent conversations are a little bit more nuanced, giving the athlete options and allowing them to understand all the things at play. In regards to treatment decisions, I think I use the dynamical systems to model the way I look at exercise as a constraints-led approach, which is not actually what these papers are talking about. That's what we talked about with coaching the power clean a few meetings back. But I think it allows me, looking at a lens through a complex systems model, or looking at these cases through that lens, at least allows me to embrace the uncertainty a little bit more. But to what extent is hard to say without us digging into cases and really talking through that.
Yeah, I think that's a hard question to answer. I mean, similar to you, from like a prescription standpoint, kind of like constraints-led approach has definitely kind of shifted my view on things. But I think in regards to like specifically to like complex theory, I think it's helped me improve kind of like patient education and just really kind of breaking down like the barriers between clinician and patient and just kind of letting them in on, look, this is all the factors that we're kind of considering right here. And this is why at times I may be providing you with answers that may not be to your liking because I don't necessarily know the answers. I can just kind of provide you with, these are all the things that we're considering. These are all the factors that can come into play throughout this process. And I think in that sense, it helps from a patient education standpoint to maybe establish buy-in and just get them kind of on board to the process and maybe just help them come to a better understanding of why things may seem very fluid throughout the process, as opposed to just kind of standard, this, and this is what we're going to do throughout the entirety. So I think being able to kind of bring them into the thought process and show them all the aspects that go into this and the things that we need to consider. I think that's been helpful for me. That could be just totally off base, but that's kind of how I feel like it's been more practical for me.
Alex kind of mirrors that. He says, it's been helpful in knowing that we can't prevent injury overall and having better conversations with our patients, clients, athletes around risk, preparation, mindset. So it just kind of comes into, informed consent is the key term, informed consent. It kind of allows you to take it all in and to have the conversation about the big picture. And that's really all we can do as healthcare providers, is give our recommendations and inform the person of all the factors that are involved in the decision and the choices that they have, to take part in certain treatments or going forward, participating in sport based on whatever risks that you appraise of the situation. But Cody's got another good comment here and a question about, they talked in the paper about movement variability, and that's kind of another related but kind of related but separate rabbit hole to go into, but they talk about it, and let's say in regards to fatigue. So movement variability, think of it as, in a very simplistic way, as kind of a U-shaped curve, where you have a certain Goldilocks zone of, well, it could be a bell-shaped curve as well, but you have a certain Goldilocks zone when you're doing or performing movements where you want the body to be able to adapt with each repetition, to be able to kind of absorb the changes in the environment in any given moment. So let's say a beginner who's doing a new movement is going to have a ton of variability from rep to rep. And we'll say this is coordinative variability. The movement's going to look very different from rep to rep because they haven't honed that skill. As they get more skillful in any particular pattern, or more coordinated in any particular pattern, the variability will actually decrease to an extent where they can really hone in, and now it becomes more repeatable. Well, what's interesting is you become an expert mover, you regain variability, but it's now under your control. It's functional variability as it's described in the literature, where now each rep can look different, but it's because you have such nuanced skill that you can really adapt to the environment. So take a basketball player who, when they're first learning how to shoot, everything looks different and the ball's hitting every part of the rim and backboard but going in the basket. When you get better, you can shoot free throws and really make it repeatable, but you can't do anything else. You can't fade away to your left, fade away to your right. When you're very skilled, you can now make the basket. The outcome is the same, but you can do so with varying environments, with opponents, with fans, fading left, fading right, fading back, doesn't matter, left hand, right hand. So that's kind of that change in variability. Now, what the paper was talking about is when you take into account other factors, let's say fatigue, that variability window might shrink. And then what Cody asks here, he says, could the dynamic nature of the movement system result in changes in movement variability that would decrease load sharing across tissues and increase the likelihood of cumulative tissue injury? And he says, Norden and Dufek 2019 is a good resource here. What sort of constraints would play a role? Well, fatigue could be a constraint, so capacity. I mean, sometimes the constraint is just the activity. You know, sometimes it's just, if it's just all running, yeah, I mean, your pattern might be variable from step to step in a kind of an augmented way for running, but ultimately it's a very similar tissue strain pattern over time, you know, whether you're fatigued or not. So it could just be the activity. The dosage of said activity. But to your point, and I think that's the point that they were making in the paper, altered variability of some degree could then create that cumulative micro injury cascade. Again, hard to measure.
Yeah, and I think even that lies on a spectrum, right? Because too much variability kind of eliminates, or, you know, it gets you into that area of chaos. Whereas at the other end, if the system's too rigid or too stable, then maybe we run into some of the stuff that Cody's referencing here, and sort of like the inability to dissipate loads throughout tissues. So I think that's what's very difficult about this, is it all kind of lies on a spectrum. And what I think we're really looking for is what's that optimal balance between system rigidity and system variability. And I think that's what this paper is getting at. And that's the question that we're all kind of pondering around or jumping around is, and we don't know the answer to that. You know, how much variability is too much? How much do you need?
Jared Boyd here, who by the way works in the NBA, says in regards to Kobe and Durant question earlier, they both were already doing eccentric landing repeatedly with high volumes during games. Right. Yeah. So the game itself was giving them that. Thus, it would likely not be efficacious to do drop landings, eccentric loading in training, as it may induce loads higher than their current capacity tolerance. Perhaps providing variability into the system to act as protector would be more meaningful, such as heavy, slow, i.e. Keith Barr, providing constituents that they do not have to serve as an injury moderator. Yeah, so maybe, you know, so maybe not just doing more of the thing that they were already getting in the games, but switching up the stimulus a bit, but you're changing the impulse to the tissues. So you have high loads going through the tendons during stretch shortening cycles, obviously, but the impulse is very short, and maybe changing that impulse profile, you know, imparting load across the tissues, high load, but spreading that out over a broader time domain. You know, why that's protective, don't know. But, and again, maybe they were already doing, you know, slow, heavy calf raises. We don't know. But to Jared's point and to the movement variability conversation, you know, if they're getting, you want to look at what they're already getting in game and practice, and just doing more of that may not be the ticket. We got a couple hands up, actually. Nathan, you are on, my friend. I think you're muted. Sorry.
Hello?
Okay. What's up, buddy?
Hey, two things. One, you were talking earlier about evidence showing a relationship between interoception and injury rate. And there's a 2018 systematic review or meta-analysis by Eckerd that shows that internal training load was more predictive of injury than external training load. And I think session RP was the most commonly used metric. So at least in that respect, there is some evidence to support that athletes can sort of feel when an injury is imminent or not. So like having repeated 9 RPE sessions is probably predictive. And then the other thing, I really like we're talking about movement variability. And that's sort of a way that we can make this clinically applicable is, for example, if you have an ACL patient who has no quad strength, they're going to use a hip strategy. That means they can only dissipate forces with a hip strategy. But if they're in a situation where they have to have a vertical trunk, like they're receiving a ball overhead, then it's beneficial to us to provide them the capacity for, so both the muscular capacity and the motor skills to use a more quad dominant strategy. And that applies probably to every athlete. In most circumstances, you should sort of systematically change the motor constraints of tasks so they have multiple motor solutions for a given task, so that they are less, so that they have workarounds of the micro and meso injuries that may exist.
They've got options, right? And that's what movement variability is about. I'm glad you brought that up, because you guys, that's so related to the podcast with Eric Mara that just dropped today. But I think that's what, from a applicability standpoint, clinically, we can kind of take from the movement variability piece, is just giving the athlete the options to do so. So they still might use a hip strategy, or they still might cut with a locked knee, because honestly, sometimes performance dictates that. Planting a straight knee into the ground and jamming hard into that hip might be a great way to change direction. Ask somebody who throws a javelin. That plant step, locked straight, and they, like my thrower friends tell me, like the cue is to jam your hip back as hard as you possibly can with a locked knee. And say that's what creates that ground reaction force, because there's no give in the system. For a field sport athlete, that might be the strategy they use sometimes. But the problem, and I think, Nathan, the point that you were making here, is that when it's their only strategy, then we might say that we might be increasing risk at that point. When the only strategy is to cut, change direction, decelerate, stop with a locked knee. And that's just one example. But if they have, yeah, go ahead.
I'm getting deja vu. I think we had this exact conversation last journal club.
I'm probably going to bring it to every journal club, no matter what the topic is.
It was like the exact conversation, I think.
If it's low back pain.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Nathan, thanks for that.
Yep.
Mamad, and I'm probably mispronouncing your name, and I apologize, but you are on. Maybe. I'll try again later. I'll try in a second, buddy. Javier, on page 6 of 8, section titled Assessment of Musculoskeletal System Susceptibility to Injury Through Connectivity Measure. What do you both think of the statement? And I'll throw this out to all of you. What do you think of the statement of the development of new objective measures based on connectivity properties such as tensegrity is desirable. Tensegrity is one of those cool words. What does this mean to you guys, and how is this quantifiable? So I don't have the answer to that. And I think it just mostly falls into what we've been talking about. I think tensegrity is a word that has been thrown out a lot over the years, and you'll see it a lot in the motor learning research. And it's kind of one of those terms that helps you create some context around things. Oh, tensegrity, kind of the body, these coordinative patterns where, my foot's interaction with the ground can potentially affect, my throwing angle up top, this kind of regional interdependence model. And from a hypothetical plausibility standpoint, it's one of those things like, yeah, but the word itself, I'm not sure holds much validity from a scientific measure standpoint, as in it's not necessarily an outcome that we can quantify. As in this system, we're measuring tensegrity in this system, and then we can intervene, and now tensegrity of the system is increased X percent. And we can repeat that over time. So that's kind of my thought.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a great depth of understanding. I know that is certainly, I mean, there's textbooks and stuff on that, and I think you can probably take that a long ways. I can't really speak to it. I kind of think of it more in terms of just like mechanotransduction. I don't know if that's kind of living in the same realm there. So sorry, Javier, I can't speak too much to the kind of the whole concept and model of tensegrity.
But I think they did it. I think there's a reference there if you want to dig into it, because I do have a couple papers where tensegrity is kind of I'll try to dig them up, is the topic of the paper. But again, they're not studies. They're kind of more of the same, just because it's kind of hypothetical. Stephen was asking about the article that Nathan threw out, the Eckhart article, and I'm just actually going to post that in the chat. So I just posted a link there. And I think also, just to clarify, there were internal load markers did seem to matter. I don't know if it was session RPE as a standalone or if it was session RPE load, which is an SRPE score multiplied by some type of arbitrary unit. So it's kind of a mix between an objective and a subjective measure. But regardless, the paper's there for you guys. Okay. Jared says, in regard to isometric / heavy slow as a loading scheme for potential injury moderators, number one, stress, relaxation, and targeted nutrition to treat patellar tendinopathy. That would be more like Keith Barr, I think, right? And number two, maximizing injury and maximizing return to play. Both Keith Barr. Okay, yeah, that's what you said. So are those, Jared, just to clarify, are those papers from Keith Barr? Because I'll throw those in the chat. Yes, papers. Okay, cool. So I threw those in the chat, and Keith Barr, that's 2 A's. So I'll say this. I like Keith Barr. I think we've actually even talked about him a little bit on the show, where there's some leaps of faith there, I think, sometimes. And I think I want him to publish a lot of the data that he references in his lab. He always
Yeah, you and I talked about this. I heard him, I can't remember if he was being interviewed or something, but he talked about how there was someone had a hole in their patellar tendon that they identified with diagnostic ultrasound, because he's big in like the collagen supplementation and, certain loading schemes, whether that's, like jump rope or things like that with targeted nutrition. I think that's the paper that Jared's referring to, but I couldn't find anything like published, like you said, because he was talking about how they did a diagnostic ultrasound prior to and then initiated treatment, and essentially they saw complete turnover and remodeling of the patellar tendon, which kind of runs counter to a lot of tendinopathy land, where we're seeing that, once you hit early adolescence, that thing doesn't really turn over much at all. So that's been my biggest kind of gripe with him as well, is I think a lot of his stuff is great, and I certainly can get on board with a good majority of it. But there, like you said, there are some leaps there that I'm not quite fully on board with yet.
Well, if you guys want some entertainment, just look up some old Twitter wars between Keith Barr and Jill Cook. Vincent says, I might be able to ask Keith Barr to come on as a guest to talk about his research. That'd be awesome. I had him as a professor in undergrad. We'd love to have him on. And I know a bunch of people in the community clinical athlete forum who would love that too, because there's a lot of talk about Keith Barr. Sometimes he's polarizing, it seems like. So it would be pretty cool to have him on the show. Well, what do you think about these papers? I kind of thought this was going to be how it goes. We try to find something tangible to pull out of, but again, that initial lens of the dynamical systems model, just embracing the fact that these things are nonlinear, the process of rehab, the process of training, the experience of pain, are very much dynamic, nonlinear, emergent phenomena. And the dynamical systems model at least allows you to frame that uncertainty and kind of put it into words. And like some people have said here, it can shape your education, and it can allow you to become a little bit more nuanced and a little bit less dogmatic about certain, say, treatments or why something worked or why it didn't. Because a lot of these things are hard to explain. And Cody wants to add a reference too. And his reference is reviewing the variability overuse injury hypothesis. Does movement variability relate to landing injuries? Thanks for that. So guys, go to the chat and copy and paste that article title into Google. That's a good reference.
That's another good topic. Just kind of the
movement
role
variability.
The role and the value of movement variability.
Cody, we might have to make that paper another topic here. We've got a couple hands raised. Ooh. Hold on, Cody, I got to unmute you. Shit. Unmute. Oh, come on.
How about now?
How about now? We're good.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to add that reference in. So I was looking at this figure 4 in the first paper talking about injury connectivity, and just trying to think about like how mechanistically, how are those dots connected, right? So it talks about micro injury, you kind of leading up to meso injury and then macro injury, and just thinking about what are some potential mechanisms as to how those dots are connected. And so I thought that the concept of variability overuse hypothesis is kind of an interesting way to reconcile that. They talk about it a little bit in that first paper, but I believe this one by Norden and Dufek has been published since, and they kind of review the existing literature on the variability overuse injury hypothesis, and then talk about some of their own work in drop landing. And basically you guys have kind of touched on this already, but the idea that we tend to see variability in movement, how people perform the task. And as they're having to do like drop landing tasks, and as they increase the height of the task closer and closer to, and then surpassing 100% of the person's like individual maximum jump height, they found that the movement strategy decreased in variability. And so the hypothesis is that as you increase the demand of the task, you get less trial to trial movement variability that could maybe put repetitive load kind of on the same tissues over and over again. And that might explain kind of how these dots are connected in terms of injury connectivity. And you know, they mentioned that this has something to do with task demand, which makes sense because they're kind of seeing this decrease in variability as the demand of the task increases. You know, you may consider just novelty of task or just the relative difficulty. So like as a match or a game goes on and you're becoming fatigued, the same movement you've been doing all the time, the relative intensity is increasing, right? And so maybe your variability, if the thing that you're doing a lot of anyways, the variability is maybe decreasing as you're becoming more fatigued. Maybe there's motivational factors. They talk about, the impact of, maybe what your coach is saying, or like what's going on in the game, or how tired you are, motivation, those sorts of things maybe affect the person's movement variability. And I thought that was an interesting kind of hypothesis, and their paper maybe provides a little more insight as to how you might connect the dots with the injury connectivity concept that's in that first paper.
And then the question, Cody, is too, like, maybe there's some sports like powerlifting or weightlifting or archery, sports where the system is more closed and the movements are more repeatable by nature, and there's not such a chaotic environment, where you want to potentially reduce variability compared to other more kind of open system sports, where the more that you're repetitively stressing the tissues might actually lead to better performance. Then the question is, well, when to intervene. So let's say that we could even measure or image this micro trauma occurring over time. Like, we could model and predict, like, the avalanche is gonna happen, but they're at an all-time high from a performance perspective and about to win gold or whatever contract scholarship on the line. There's a lot of, yeah.
I was gonna say, I think this is where you can make a pretty good argument for something discrete like weightlifting or powerlifting. You can make a good argument for movement variability within training. So, instead of doing, if it's powerlifting, the comp squat or the competitive variation of the squat, whatever it is, low bar, one specific stance, and doing that same variation all the time. Maybe alternatively, you've got that on one day and then you have some variation on the other day. And over time, you're giving less of a large percentage of your training volume to the same specific task over and over again. And you've got kind of close variations where you're still developing strength and skill for that movement, but you're applying different loads. So you have more of that movement variability. So I think that's kind of one area where you could use this model to make an argument for increasing variability and allowing variability within training, even if it's with the same discrete movement rep to rep, having variability in how the person's performing it and kind of allowing that within a certain range.
And not to sound insensitive to the current situation, but that almost is, we can liken that to flattening the curve a bit, to where any type of high level training may have some type of repercussion, and a squat, has a similar strain pattern to a squat, but it's different enough now. Like you said, if you have enough variation in training, you might have these micro traumas occurring and connecting, but the rate is much slower and you actually never get to that avalanche.
That's spot on.
Yeah, it's interesting. And so when I was digging in, I started this PowerPoint on, it was supposed to be isometrics for tendinopathy. I started this 2 years ago, and it turned into a 250 slide thing of nothing that's just sitting in my drive right now, because that's just how shit works out sometimes. It became this like overview of tendons, and then I went into the black hole of tendon land and just got out as fast as I can. I said, fuck this, I can't. But the actual mechanism was interesting. They're looking at these fibrillar kinks in the tissues, where they're actually able now to image on the micro scale these literal kinks in the tendon tissues that they think is what we're seeing in these kind of more macro images of like CT ultrasounds, looking at the hypoechoic areas, or if we drill down to the micro scale, we're actually seeing the tissues be kinked, and then they're losing their ability to transfer force through those tensile structures. And so that might actually be what we're talking about when we literally say these micro injuries that are occurring over time. It's just, again, how to model that in real time with an athlete. We're just not there.
I think that's from a more practical standpoint, kind of getting into the movement variability aspects, is there anything that you guys kind of implement to kind of touch base or gauge, is this person losing a certain degree of movement variability? I think one thing that kind of pops to my mind just thinking about it is if we look at something like the overhead thrower and we're kind of assessing like loss of shoulder flexion throughout the season, we do have correlational data to suggest that puts you at an increased risk for something like UCL injury. So do you guys have anything that you kind of implement on a regular basis to kind of more or less track, is this person losing a certain degree of movement variability? And that may help kind of guide decision-making on where we want to intervene. Do we need to pull back on training? Maybe we start to add in some different variations to lifts or whatever it may be.
Not directly. There may be surrogates, as in when a lifter, if I'm looking at these session RPEs, which I have all my lifters do after the training, I'm looking at session RPEs that are climbing, but then external load and output is not climbing or it's declining. So I'm seeing that kind of inverse relationship of what we would want. And they're, reporting subjectively, feeling beat up, feeling run down, those types of things. Those might be surrogates. Like if I were to really dig into measuring joint range of motion or somehow could model their rep to rep patterning, I wouldn't be surprised if there was some type of relationship there with coordinative movement variability, but I'm not measuring that directly. And then the follow-up question would be, how much of that is adaptive to their sport? And then and then what's too much, where then we start getting into increasing risk and also maybe reducing performance because they're now literally losing motion.
Yeah. I mean, based off of some of the connectivity from aspects of this paper, you're essentially kind of adapting until you're injured, right?
Right. You don't know when that avalanche is coming.
Yeah. Mahmoud? I think you're unmuted, or maybe you have to unmute yourself. Try unmuting yourself. Cody says in the chat, Cody's, you could probably just read your own comment, I guess. You say, regarding leading indicators for loss of movement variability, it seems that drop landing is the only context that it has been specifically studied thus far and appears to be related to fatigue. RPE or something similar may be helpful here if this applies more broadly to other movements. Drop landing, what were they looking at? Were they looking at degree of knee flexion or frontal angle? Kind of knee frontal angle? Because I'd be interested to look at that too. Because that's basically an answer to your question, Kevin, or at least what's out there. Is anyone familiar with other movements that have been studied in regards to movement variability and fatigue? I'm going to have to dig in because I've got a lot of studies. I've got a lot of papers saved on movement variability, and the question of exactly what outcome measure is something that I would not surprised if I would have missed that kind of going through these papers over time. So it's an interesting question. That's a good topic because that's essentially what this has kind of devolved into, is what things can we use to gauge where this person's at along this continuum or within that curve of readiness or preparedness.
So Abby just shared a link. It's a PubMed link in the chat, and it is a paper titled Reviewing the Variability Overuse Injury Hypothesis. Does movement variability relate to landing injuries? So that's interesting. I'll have to dig into that. It's a narrative review, but maybe they pull some studies that help to answer the question. So thank you for that. Anything else, guys? At minimum, maybe we found another topic. Maybe there's light at the end of this dark tunnel.
I think that's a good topic though, because I think that would maybe provide a little bit more insight into all of the garbage and ideas that are floating around in everyone's heads right about now.
Yeah, because ultimately these two papers are speaking to researchers, and they're speaking to people who geek out on machine learning and mathematical modeling. And that was kind of the call out in where do we go from here in both sections of these papers is the sports science and the data science side of things, which obviously can help, but obviously have limitations. And, you know, as the clinician, it's what can we take from this? And perhaps we can go that route there. And Max says, to me, the question of how much variability is necessary is very sport specific. For me, I compete and coach rock climbing where every single climb is different. So in this case, having lots and lots of movement strategies and variability rep to rep is needed to be very successful. Contrasted to something like powerlifting, probably not so much from a performance perspective. Thoughts? Yeah, I think I would agree with that. And it's on a sliding scale. So like what Cody outlined there is that you can still vary the sport, but it's still within the domain of the sport to some degree. You're not saying, okay, I need to increase the variability of this powerlifter. Let's go out and run some, 110 repeats.
Yeah, that's where we talk about the spectrum, right? Because an overly rigid system is going to be just as problematic as one that has too much variability. It's just but we don't know, like you said, that's going to come down to an N=1 as to what's ideal along that spectrum.
But I love the example. Rock climbing is a great example. Literally every movement is going to be different from the last. I mean, that's repetition without repetition. I mean, Nikolai Bernstein would say that's every movement and every task. It doesn't matter. But again, it's to the degree that it's different. And if you're a rock climber and your variability is reduced now from a coordinative standpoint that you've now lost range of motion, that's probably a big deal. Now, I don't know if that happens from rep to rep necessarily, but with fatigue, potentially. And with training load, as with anything else, over time, if that's not managed and modulated, to a recoverable dose, then potentially. So yeah, good topic. I think we've potentially got something there. We just kind of have to pick a paper that gives us a jumping off point. And we might have some options here, but I want to thank, we'll go ahead and end it there before we get too far down the hole and just start rambling even more. So thanks everybody for tuning in, and hopefully you got something out of it. If nothing else, you got some things to dig into a little bit more. If you want some clarity, always look into the paper's reference list. If you like the paper, you like the topic, you can look up the author on ResearchGate and on Google Scholar and PubMed, and you can actually save them to your favorites. So you could get an email every time that author comes out with new pieces, which is always useful. And that's a lot of times how I'm getting some of these papers is, I get that email. And so until next time, thanks everyone. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Cody and Nathan and everybody who joined in.
See you guys. Thanks everyone for joining. Quinn, we'll talk to you later.
All right, brother.